In the winter of 1878, when snow fell on Castile like white ash from a funeral pyre, the bells of the cathedrals did not ring for weddings or funerals. They rang for something nameless, a tremor moving through stone. The air in the plazas smelled of wax and iron. Horse hooves struck the cobbles like muffled drums. Behind heavy wooden doors, men in cassocks whispered prayers that turned sour on their tongues. In taverns, where olive oil smoked and cheap wine ran like blood, they spoke of a wife, small hands, black veil, who moved from parish to parish like a shadow, and wherever she walked, holy men fell ill. Some said she carried a vial of nightshade sewn into her corset. Others swore her eyes alone could cloud a chalice with death. The newspapers printed nothing, the bishops signed nothing, yet beneath the incense and Latin, Spain's Catholic heart was convulsing, and no one could say why. This is not a story from a penny dreadful. It is a fragment of Europe's hidden marrow, preserved in sealed archives, buried by magistrates and bishops. You are about to step into a room they tried to seal, a room where poison smelled of sanctity and confession meant nothing. Each detail you will hear has been dragged from the margins of forgotten reports, each name once written on a page. No one was meant to see. As you listen, picture the snow settling on the convent roofs. Picture a woman's gloved fingers stirring a pot of soup in a kitchen lined with icons. Picture the men of God lifting spoons and crossing themselves before swallowing. This is where we begin, at the edge of the known, staring into the forbidden. Before we go further, I must know who sits in this darkness with me. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. Castilla in 1878 appeared ordinary at first glance. Markets bustling with bread and owls, lives, priests blessing children in the plazas, nuns selling candles to travelers. Smoke from fireplaces curled through chimneys, and life seemed steady. But beneath the stone arches and tiled roofs, something thinner, colder, and more deliberate was moving. Hunger had hollowed faces, politics had sharpened every sermon, and fear slithered quietly along the corridors of power. The church's authority was no longer absolute. Liberal ideas and secret lodges whispered between walls, shaping minds even as incense burned. Into this trembling world stepped Isabella Aranda. She was slight, almost fragile in appearance, but her hands were precise, her eyes calculating. She smiled with the warmth of service, poured wine with the elegance of a hostess, and carried herself with the air of someone who had rehearsed every gesture. No one suspected the storm that followed her movements. In kitchens across Castile, she prepared meals that looked innocent. Soups simmering with vegetables, bread rising in the ovens, wine pouring from polished decanters, yet each bite, each sip, contained something invisible, measured, deadly. By the spring, 6 priests had already perished, one after the other, each death appearing coincidental, each illness whispered away as unfortunate misfortune. Bishops met behind closed doors, weighing whether to investigate or preserve the church's image. Citizens went about their days, hearing the bells ring, smelling the bread baking, oblivious to the pattern forming under their noses. And Isabella continued her rounds, head bowed, hands steady, moving with the rhythm of a shadow no one could trap. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying. She was a wife, a servant, a companion, and simultaneously a force reshaping the fates of men of God. The paradox of her smile and her silence unsettled even the most steadfast observers. While ordinary life went on, the undercurrent of fear, suspicion, and invisible death flowed stronger each day. You are listening now, standing at the edge of that current, watching the pattern emerge, feeling its pulse. The deaths, the cover-ups, the whispered rumors, all of it was converging into something far larger than a single woman, something designed to test faith, loyalty, and attention itself. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Isabella Aranda's story did not begin in the polished kitchens of Spain's cathedrals. She was born at the edge of La Mancha, in a wind-scoured village where winter stripped the earth bare and the night seemed endless. Her father was a mule trader, a man whose hands smelled of leather and smoke, whose voice grew silent after dusk. Her mother was a healer whispered to know the language of herbs, roots and flowers, a woman whose remedies could cure fever and whose mixtures could kill if misused. From childhood, Isabella learned to recognize the subtle line between medicine and poison. Villagers sometimes saw her crouched near the streams, gathering plants under the moonlight, whispering the names of roots and berries as if speaking to ghosts. In church, she lowered her eyes and spoke little, yet there was a tension in her presence, a quiet defiance. She watched men of God devour her mother's remedies, then returned to sermons about sin and virtue. She saw power operate like a shadow, invisible yet crushing. At 17, she married a minor clerk in the bishopric. The marriage offered respectability, not affection. Behind the veil of domestic life, she continued her lessons in patience, observation, and the measured use of knowledge. She learned to hide her true intent in plain sight, practicing the art of seeming obedience while cultivating the skills that would one day allow her to manipulate life and death. By the time she arrived in the kitchens of powerful parishes, she had the precision of a master, the patience of a predator. Each movement was deliberate, every smile calculated. She could bend men with words, coax them with meals, and leave them none the wiser. To the world she appeared ordinary, a devoted wife, a faithful servant, a woman who knew her place. But her eyes, always slightly lowered, and her hands always steady, betrayed the shadow of what she carried within. You are not just hearing the story of a woman. You are witnessing a lineage of knowledge, a sequence of choices cultivated over decades, shaped by hidden power and silent observation. Each death that followed was an extension of this careful training. And now, as you listen, you begin to see not only her actions, but the architecture that allowed them to succeed. The ledger of her deeds is unfolding before you. Every line you hear, every name whispered in this narrative draws you further into the corridor of secrets where men of God met their fates. Are you ready to follow the ledger deeper, to watch the pattern emerge? The story grows darker from here. The first death arrived like a shadow slipping through a doorway. In Segovia, a parish priest who had praised Isabella's cooking fell ill after a winter supper. At first it was dismissed, a stomach infection, perhaps a passing fever. But when he vomited black bile and collapsed within days, whispers began. The doctors called it cholera. The bishop called it God's will. No one asked questions. A month later, a canon in Burgos fell after a banquet, and then another in Salamanca. Each had eaten from the same hands, drank from the same decanter, and yet no one connected the dots. Coincidence, they said. Fate, they said. But the pattern was forming. Rumors spread faster than carriages. Villagers and townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of a woman in black, traveling between parishes, leaving funerals in her wake. Some claimed to have glimpsed her eyes in the flicker of candlelight, glinting like steel. Some said she whispered, blessings while administering poison. In private chambers, priests burned letters that described her movements. Others hid the notes beneath floorboards, reading the handwriting as if it contained a cipher. Fear grew, subtle and relentless. Fathers warned sons, mothers clutched children closer at Mass, and the streets themselves seemed to quiet whenever her shadow passed. By spring, 6 men of God lay in graves. Each funeral was conducted with solemn ritual, the bells ringing as if to drown out the questions that nobody dared ask. Bishops held clandestine meetings, weighing the cost of scandal against the need for truth. Doctors noted the similarities in each illness, but their reports vanished before they reached the archives. And through it all, Isabella continued her rounds. She smiled, she poured wine, she nodded politely to her husband and to the clergy. Her hands never trembled, her face never faltered. The storm was building in silence, unseen yet inevitable. This is the point in the story where you begin to understand the nature of the ledger. The deaths are not random. They are carefully measured. A rhythm established across months. A shadow pattern emerging in the most visible places while remaining invisible to the untrained eye. You are being invited to see the same pattern now. The kitchens, the chalices, the meetings. Each is a chapter, each a test of attention and perception. As you listen, feel the rhythm, recognize it. This is the architecture of secrecy, and you are standing at its edge, poised to step further. By the early summer of 1878, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Reports of illness among priests had grown too consistent, too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. In small villages and major towns alike, whispers carried through cobbled streets, a woman who moved from parish to parish, leaving death in her wake. But no one dared confront her directly. The church feared scandal more than corpses. The government feared the church's collapse. And so Spain's most powerful men became unwitting accomplices, guarding a secret they did not fully understand. Isabella herself appeared unchanged, serene as ever. She continued her routines with mechanical precision, kneeling at Mass, serving meals, pouring wine. Her presence was comforting and disarming, masking the deadly calculations behind every gesture. Meanwhile, the ordinary life of the towns carried on. Children played in the plazas, merchants sold bread and olives, the bells rang for Mass, all while the shadow of death moved quietly between kitchens, chapels, and sacristies. Her power was not brute force. It was subtle, psychological, almost ritualistic. In Madrid, Dr. Valdez, a young physician, began to notice the pattern. He compiled notes from doctors in Segovia, Burgos, Salamanca, and Toledo. Each report described similar symptoms: burning throats, blackened lips, sudden collapse. Yet official channels ignored his warnings. Archbishops intercepted letters, magistrates delayed investigations, and Valdez realized the machinery of concealment was as dangerous as the poison itself. For every death, there was a silent hand covering tracks, erasing evidence, bending society's perception to a false order. Outside the church, whispers transformed into legends. Tavern-goers muttered about La Esposa del Veneno, the wife of poison. Stories spread of black-veiled visits to rectories, of smiles that concealed death, of meals that were both blessing and curse. Each tale, embellished with terror, only heightened the mystery, making the unseen force behind the deaths feel larger than life. And still, Isabella moved, calm and collected, her ledger of names growing with each passing month. You, listening now, are tracing the same path. You are beginning to perceive the architecture of hidden power, how an institution protects itself, how silence can become a weapon, and how attention, patience, and calculation can wield a quiet but absolute control over life and death. Notice the rhythm, the method, the careful timing. It is all deliberate, and it is all visible, if you are willing to see. The deeper you go, the more you will recognize the patterns that others refuse to name. The first real crack in Isabella's carefully maintained mask came not in a cathedral, nor in a grand rectory, but in a modest boarding house in Leon. A young seminarian, newly assigned to assist a priest recovering from sudden illness, noticed something unusual. The kitchen smelled faintly of almonds, a scent so subtle it could be mistaken for baking bread. Yet he saw her fingers crushing herbs over a chalice, her gloved hands moving with surgical precision. He froze, understanding that the act was deliberate, calculated, and deadly. He said nothing. Fear and awe sealed his lips. But later, in the quiet of his room, he scribbled a letter describing a small, dark-haired woman moving between parishes, serving communion and death with the same smile. That letter vanished in official channels, intercepted by the bishopric, but a copy survived, reaching Dr. Valdez in Madrid. Valdez began comparing it with his own records of deaths and illnesses, recognizing the same signature of precision, the same invisible hand guiding the pattern. The poison she employed was no ordinary nightshade. It was a hybrid, whispered of by a few old herbalists, known to leave almost no trace. Its subtlety allowed her to continue moving through Spain undetected, even as the death toll mounted. Each priest who fell became both victim and unwitting participant in her design. The church's machinery of secrecy covered her movements, destroying reports, intercepting letters, and silencing witnesses. And still, she traveled, smiling, serving, blessing, leaving only traces of her method for the few who dared to notice. The young seminarian later died of a sudden, inexplicable fever. It was dismissed as coincidence, influenza, or God's will, yet Valdez recognized the pattern. He realized then that Isabella was not just a murderer. She was a master of manipulation, exploiting the very systems meant to protect her victims. Each act was layered, chemical, psychological, and institutional. Her power was total because it was invisible. You are now seeing what Valdez saw, that true control rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, invisibly, behind trust, obedience, and ritual. Each death, each illness, each erased report is part of a deliberate rhythm. As you listen, pay attention to the cadence. Notice the interplay of action and silence. The pattern is being revealed not only in history, but in your perception, training your mind to see what others accept blindly. You are stepping further into the ledger, and there is no turning back. Autumn fell across Castile like a slow bruise, the wind rattling shutters and stirring the first dead leaves along cobblestones. Dr. Valdez traveled cautiously, moving from parish to parish, under the guise of routine medical visits, carrying his growing journal of anomalies. Each village seemed ordinary at first glance, smoke curling from chimneys, children playing in the streets, priests blessing the faithful. Yet beneath the surface, the same invisible hand-shaped events, leaving death in its wake. In each town, the subtle signs of her work, the faint almond scent, the ledger of names whispered by those who survived, followed him like a shadow he could never outrun. Valdez visited the archives in Madrid, digging through records that were meant to stay hidden. He uncovered sealed testimony from priests who had fallen ill, letters that were censored or destroyed, notes describing symptoms so precise they could only point to one thing: deliberate poisoning. When he tried to present his findings to the church, they were dismissed, ignored, or quietly removed from the official record. A polite letter arrived, warning him to preserve the dignity of the church. He understood immediately. He was no longer a physician seeking truth. He was a witness to a system that preferred death to disclosure. Meanwhile, Isabella continued her movements with the serene grace of a predator. She was invited to dinners, entrusted with meals, praised for her devotion. No one questioned her, and yet every bite, every sip carried intent. Villagers began to notice the pattern, whispering her name as though it were a curse, marking her passage with nervous glances and hushed prayers. Her presence was a lesson in the power of invisibility, how a single calculated figure could exploit trust, ritual, and institutional silence to manipulate outcomes far beyond what ordinary force could achieve. By the end of the season, the death toll had climbed, reports had vanished, and Valdez felt the weight of an inescapable truth. The ledger was growing, the names multiplying silently under stone floors and behind closed doors. And you, listening now, are tracing the same pattern, feeling the rhythm of control, the methodical unfolding of events hidden in plain sight. Each detail matters. Each sequence is deliberate. Step carefully. Pay attention. The architecture of secrecy has been revealed to you, but only if you choose to see. This is the moment when history begins to feel dangerously alive. By late autumn, the shadow of Isabella's movements stretched farther than any town could hold. In Valladolid, a young priest named Father Alonso noticed her at a private supper, the firelight glinting in her dark eyes as she moved between the serving dishes and the chalices. Something about her calm precision unsettled him. He had heard the rumors, whispered warnings from traveling seminarians, And yet here she was, smiling politely as if the world were ordinary and safe. That smile, Father Alonso realized, was the most dangerous part of her. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a cloak all at once. Determined, He followed her quietly after dinner, observing her carefully in the dim hallways. Chabert. He moved like water, slipping between doors, stopping briefly to adjust a candle, her gloved hands lingering over a small vial concealed beneath her sleeve. The sense of ritual was hypnotic. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and unseen. He could almost feel the weight of her control in the air, a pull as tangible as gravity. The thought struck him with terror. This was not merely a woman. She was an instrument of power honed to perfection, trained in patience, observation, and precision, wielding influence over life and death without anyone noticing. Father Alonso attempted to confront her in the privacy of the kitchen, stepping forward with trembling hands. He asked a question, a simple query about the herbs she had been grinding. She looked at him calmly, eyes lowering slightly, and replied with a measured voice that offered no answer, only the warmth of obedience. And yet, in that instant, he understood that he had been observed all along. Every reaction, every gesture, every hesitation had been noted. He realized the horror of it. He was a part of her experiment, another element in the silent ledger of deaths that had spread across Spain. By the time Father Alonso returned to his quarters, the first chills of fear had taken root in his stomach. He recorded his observations in secret, aware that if the wrong person discovered them, he might vanish like so many others. Meanwhile, Isabella continued her rounds, as if nothing had occurred, her smile intact, her purpose unbroken. And you, listening now, are witnessing this same sequence. The calm surface, the hidden rhythm, the manipulation of trust. Step carefully, because the ledger is still being written, and the names that follow are never random. By the winter of 1878, Dr. Valdez had realized the ledger was no longer a local pattern. It had become a national design. From Segovia to Toledo, from Burgos to Salamanca, the deaths followed a rhythm so precise it could only belong to someone orchestrating them with an invisible hand. Valdez moved cautiously, tracing the path of a woman who was at once present and absent, watching her from a distance, noting the towns she visited, the meals she prepared, the men who fell ill soon after. Each report, each whisper, each faint smell of almonds in a kitchen became a line in his private ledger. The church, sensing scrutiny, began its own countermeasures. Reports were intercepted, letters disappeared from archives. Doctors who spoke too loudly were reassigned to distant parishes or vanished entirely. Valdez noticed the pattern not only of the deaths, but of the concealment, the deliberate shaping of reality to maintain order, to hide the truth. It was a system that rewarded obedience and punished curiosity. And yet, for all its power, it could not erase the rhythm of her movements, the quiet certainty of her calculated path. Meanwhile, in towns across Spain, Isabella moved like a shadow, her presence both comforting and deadly. People noticed only the surface, her polite smiles, her quiet manners, her dedication to household duties. But beneath it all, the architecture of control extended outward, invisible. Meals were prepared, wine poured, herbs ground, each with precision, each a subtle manipulation of life and death. She was no longer simply a woman, she was a force, an embodiment of patience and calculation, a teacher of unseen patterns to anyone who could perceive them. Valdez began sharing fragments of his findings with trusted allies, a chemist here, a seminarian there, but each warning seemed to vanish, intercepted by forces he could not see. The ledger, he realized, was not simply her record, it was a map of human institutions, showing how power could conceal, manipulate, and kill without leaving a trace. And as you listen, the same pattern reveals itself to you, the cadence of influence, the invisible lines of control, the unseen hands shaping lives. You are tracing them now. Every moment that you pay attention, every detail you notice, you step deeper into the ledger's architecture. The rabbit hole is no longer historical. It is unfolding in real time in your awareness. The new year of 1879 arrived with a biting chill that cut through Madrid's narrow streets. Valdez, increasingly obsessed, mapped Isabella's route across towns, noting the dates of deaths, the meals served, and the men who survived only by chance. Every piece of information added weight to a ledger that was growing heavier, not just with names, but with the invisible pattern of control, of careful orchestration, of psychological mastery. She was not merely killing. She was teaching, shaping, revealing the limits of human oversight, while remaining unseen. Authorities began to take notice, though slowly. Local magistrates, pressured by whispers and a few surviving doctors, questioned the reports, yet found themselves stymied at every turn. Letters vanished, testimonies were ignored, and the pattern of concealment mirrored the deadly rhythm of the poison itself. Valdez understood then that Isabella's true weapon was not her knowledge of herbs alone. It was her command over perception, her ability to manipulate trust, her talent for turning the machinery of institutions into shields that protected her while exposing others. Meanwhile, Isabella continued her rounds, moving through kitchens, dining halls, and private parlors with unerring grace. She adjusted candles, poured wine, arranged plates, all with precision. And yet, beneath the surface of these mundane gestures, each act carried the potential for death. Villagers whispered, priests grew uneasy, but none dared confront her directly. Fear, coupled with institutional inertia, ensured her path remained unchallenged. Valdez, in a moment of rare clarity, began to realize the true horror of the ledger. It was not just a record of who had died, but a map of control itself, a demonstration of how power can manipulate reality without leaving a trace. The lessons were subtle but unmistakable. The smallest actions could have vast consequences. Trust could be weaponized, and obedience could be fatal. You, listening now, are not outside this architecture. You are witnessing the same mechanisms, the same hidden patterns that shaped events in 1878. Each observation, each recognition, each moment of awareness draws you further into the ledger. The rabbit hole is real, and the descent is deliberate. Pay attention, because the next steps will reveal not only what Isabella did, but how her methods endure, silently shaping the world and those who fail to see the hidden lines of control. By spring, the ledger had grown beyond anything Valdez had imagined. Reports of sudden deaths and mysterious illnesses were no longer isolated. They were a wave rolling across towns, impossible to ignore. Even the most powerful figures began whispering in private chambers, fearing scandal, yet unable to pinpoint cause. A priest in Toledo, a canon in Salamanca, and a bishop in Valladolid had all succumbed in ways that seemed natural only to those who refused to see. But Valdez saw the pattern, traced it line by line, name by name. It was in Toledo that he first glimpsed her handiwork up close. A banquet prepared for visiting clergy revealed subtle signs, a faint, almost undetectable scent of almonds, herbs crushed in ways no ordinary cook would use, a slight hesitation in the handling of utensils. Isabella's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, her calm smile hiding the deadly calculus in her mind. The room itself seemed to bend to her rhythm. Every gesture was choreographed, every glance measured. She had trained herself to operate in plain sight, exploiting the very trust that should have protected her victims. Valdez documented everything meticulously, knowing he was walking a fine line between observation and obsession. He recorded the time each priest fell ill, the symptoms they displayed, the meals they consumed, and the subtle environmental cues that marked her presence. He realized she was teaching a lesson far larger than herself. How systems could be manipulated, how obedience and trust could be weaponized, how institutions could protect the guilty while punishing the curious. Each death was a page in her ledger, but each cover-up was a lesson in power itself. The townsfolk began murmuring her name in fear, yet no one confronted her. She had become a force both terrifying and invisible. a shadow moving effortlessly among ordinary life, testing the limits of observation and perception. Even Valdez, trained in science and medicine, began to understand the true horror. This was not only a story of poison, but a story of control, of influence, of unseen forces bending reality. And now, as you listen, the pattern extends into your own awareness. Each observation you make, each connection you recognize, draws you deeper into the architecture of secrecy. You are tracing the ledger alongside Valdez, watching the rhythm of death and cover-up, the manipulation of trust and perception. Step carefully, because the next revelations will be darker and the lessons more dangerous. The descent into the rabbit hole has only begun. The first confrontation did not happen in a courtroom, nor under the glare of public scrutiny. It occurred quietly in a small rectory kitchen in Salamanca, where Father Alonso and Dr. Valdez had both tracked her movements. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and simmering soup, the kind that usually brought comfort. Yet here, it carried a subtle, almost imperceptible note, the faint bitterness of almonds that lingered like a warning. She moved among them with serene elegance, adjusting plates, pouring wine, kneeling in quiet devotion. Nothing about her suggested danger, yet every detail screamed it. Father Alonso stepped forward, heart pounding, as he tried to articulate the suspicion that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Valdez stood behind, papers and notes clutched in his hands, evidence of the deaths, the illnesses, the strange coincidences. He began to speak, outlining his observations, hoping that reason would expose the pattern. Isabella listened, her head slightly bowed, eyes steady but calculating. Then, with the softest possible smile, she responded, not by denying or confessing, but by asking questions that redirected their attention, exposing their assumptions and insecurities. In that moment, both men understood something chilling. She had trained herself to anticipate suspicion, to manipulate perception without overt force. Her power was not only chemical, it was psychological, institutional, and invisible. Every gesture, every glance, every pause was measured. She demonstrated without words how trust could be weaponized, how obedience could be exploited, and how institutions could be turned into shields that protected her while leaving others exposed. Valdez left the rectory that night with his mind heavy, realizing the ledger of names was more than a record of deaths. It was a map of influence, a study in control, a lesson in how power could operate unseen. He could trace her movements, observe her methods, and document the outcomes. But the truth of her mastery would remain elusive unless he learned to see the patterns in the gaps, the silences, and the unspoken rituals. And now, as you listen, you are witnessing the same lesson. Observe closely. The smallest gestures, the faintest cues, the rhythm of action and silence. This is how hidden control moves through the world, shaping reality without drawing attention. Pay attention, because the ledger is growing, and every observation you make pulls you further into the architecture of secrecy. The next section will reveal the first shocking deaths that made even the church question what could be. Hidden behind a smile, Spring deepened across Castile, painting the landscape with muted greens and browns, yet the towns themselves seemed under a pall. Reports of sudden illness and inexplicable deaths among priests were no longer isolated events. They formed a rhythm impossible to ignore. From Burgos to Toledo, from Valladolid to Salamanca, men of God fell with alarming regularity, each death wrapped in ritual and silence. The church whispered of God's will, the villagers murmured rumors, and Valdez tracked the invisible hand behind it all. It was during a mid-spring banquet in Toledo that the scale of her influence became undeniable. Priests gathered, unaware that their lives were being measured, timed, and recorded by an unseen pattern. Isabella moved among them, smiling, pouring wine, arranging dishes, her gestures fluid and precise. In her presence, the room felt both ordinary and charged, as if the air itself was aware of her intentions. One by one, men began to grow pale, sweating, complaining of nausea. A cannon collapsed, clutching his stomach, followed by two more. Panic rippled through the banquet hall, but Isabella remained calm, serene, and untouchable. Valdez, observing from a corner, realized the horror of what he had been tracking. She was no longer merely poisoning individuals. She was orchestrating events on a scale that tested the very institutions around her. The church's machinery of concealment, its priorities of image over truth, ensured that no investigation could reach her in time. The townsfolk, too afraid to question her directly, whispered and prayed, believing in miracles or misfortune, never in calculation. The ledger of names had become a map, charting not only deaths, but the flow of control. Each priest who succumbed added to it, and each cover-up reinforced her power. It was a lesson in the unseen. That influence could move silently, invisible, yet with total effectiveness. The ordinary world, markets, streets, children playing, continued around them, oblivious to the calculated destruction woven into the routines of daily life. As you listen, consider this. The smallest gestures, the hidden patterns, the rhythms of trust and perception can conceal extraordinary power. You are tracing them now, noticing what others ignore, observing what is deliberately hidden. Step carefully, because the next revelations will deepen your understanding of manipulation, secrecy, and control, showing you how one woman's quiet mastery reshaped the lives of many, and how similar patterns continue to move unseen in the world today. The church could no longer dismiss the whispers. By midsummer, even bishops who had turned blind eyes began to feel the tremor of fear. The ledger was no longer a quiet collection of deaths. It had become undeniable evidence of a methodical hand moving among them. Reports of sudden illness and inexplicable collapse were being traced to a woman whose name alone struck fear: Isabella Aranda. Magistrates, doctors, and priests met behind closed doors, exchanging hushed warnings, questioning the reliability of records, and attempting to reconstruct events that had already been carefully orchestrated beyond their control. Valdez, now obsessed, tracked her movements from town to town, noting the dates of deaths, the meals served, and even the placement of candles on the table. He recognized the subtle indicators of her work: a faint scent of almonds lingering in the air, herbs ground in precise ratios, gestures that seemed innocent but were rehearsed with lethal intent. Each town she visited became another node in a network of influence, another line in the ledger that traced power, obedience, and silent fear. At a convent in Burgos, she prepared a meal for visiting priests, the same meticulous routine repeated: stirring sauces, adjusting plates, pouring wine. One by one, the men grew pale, their breaths shallow, their hands shaky. Young servants and nuns noticed nothing amiss, trusting her calm demeanor and devotion. By the time Valdez arrived, he could only document the aftermath: the sickness, the hurriedly buried notes, the whispered confessions that were never recorded. Each death reinforced the pattern, a lesson in subtlety, patience, and invisible mastery. The church, recognizing the magnitude of what was occurring, attempted to intervene. Letters were sent, investigations launched, but every effort was slowed, delayed, or misdirected. Isabella's methods were designed to exploit not just human trust, but institutional inertia. Her power lay in anticipation, predicting how people would react, how organizations would protect themselves, how rumors would diffuse without ever reaching the truth. And now, listening carefully, you begin to perceive the same patterns. You feel the rhythm of influence, the manipulation of trust, the orchestration of events that move unseen through ordinary life. Each observation you make draws you deeper into the architecture of secrecy. You are tracing the ledger alongside Valdez, recognizing the method behind the madness, understanding the quiet but absolute power of an invisible hand. Step closer, because the next revelations will show you how far the control extended and how much was deliberately hidden in plain sight. By late summer of 1879, the tremors of fear could no longer be contained within closed chambers and whispered letters. Entire towns began to sense that something unnatural was at work, though few could name it. The death toll among priests had become impossible to ignore. Parishioners whispered in marketplaces, servants exchanged fearful glances, and even the bishop's councils could no longer pretend that a hidden hand was not moving among them. Panic was brewing, subtle at first, then undeniable. Isabella continued her work with unshakable composure. As she moved between towns as if guided by an invisible map, each gesture precise, each smile calculated. Meals were prepared with meticulous care, wine poured with steady hands, herbs crushed and blended with the same deliberate rhythm. Yet it was not only her knowledge of poison that made her dangerous, it was her mastery of perception, her ability to manipulate the minds of those around her, the way she exploited trust and obedience to bend reality. No one dared confront her directly, and those who suspected rarely survived long enough to speak. Dr. Valdez, tracing her movements like a hunter following a phantom, began to recognize the depth of her mastery. Every death, every illness, every intercepted letter was part of a larger pattern, a hidden architecture of control. Institutions themselves, the church, local magistrates, even family structures, were complicit in her method, protecting her without knowing why, silencing voices that tried to expose her. It was not chaos she created, it was order, imposed invisibly, meticulously, and with absolute patience. In the plazas, in quiet streets, even in the bustling marketplaces, the rhythm of fear had begun to penetrate ordinary life. Mothers clutched children tighter at mass, shopkeepers moved faster, and servants whispered prayers under their breath. Townsfolk spoke of the black-veiled woman who moved unseen, leaving sickness and death in her wake. The ledger of her influence was no longer private. It had extended into the perception of an entire region. And now, as you listen, you are not outside this pattern. Each observation, each recognition of subtle control, draws you further into the architecture of secrecy. You are tracing the ledger with your mind, feeling the rhythm of invisible influence. If you pay close attention, you will notice the signs that ordinary eyes ignore. The cadence of control, the manipulation of trust, the subtle orchestration of events. And at this point, you must engage with the story yourself. Write a symbolic phrase twice in the comments to lock your identity transformation and fully enter the rhythm of the ledger. As autumn approached, Valdez realized that Isabella's influence was not limited to isolated towns or individual priests. It had become systemic, a network of invisible control stretching across Castile. Every parish she visited, every banquet she attended, every household where she served a meal, became another node in her ledger, another testament to her mastery. She had weaponized trust, obedience, and ritual to operate undetected, leaving devastation that looked like chance, accident, or divine will. Valdez traced her path from Valladolid to Segovia, noting patterns in meals, movements, and timing. He saw how the church's own protocols, letters sealed, reports intercepted, investigations delayed, had been co-opted into her method of concealment. She had not only poisoned men, she had poisoned perception itself. Bishops believed the deaths were natural. Villagers believed in curses. Priests believed in misfortune. But Valdez saw the rhythm, the faint almond scent lingering after a meal, the slight tremor in the hand of a host unaware of her presence. The pattern of timing between deaths that matched her meticulous itineraries. The ledger of her influence was now frighteningly clear. Every name, every town, every suppressed report was a line in an invisible map of control. Valdez documented it all in secret, aware that the very act of recording could draw attention and endanger him. He understood that Isabella's genius lay in invisibility. She operated in plain sight, yet nothing in ordinary perception could reveal her true power. She had created a system that protected her, silenced opposition, and amplified her reach without a single overt confrontation. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, fear became a tangible presence. Priests hesitated before meals, parishioners whispered warnings under breath, and familles Eilis glanced nervously at strangers. The shadow she cast was no longer metaphorical, it was a presence that moved through streets and kitchens, teaching those who noticed to question, to see, to recognize the subtle threads of control. And now, listening closely, you are tracing the same architecture. Every observation, every connection you make, every recognition of hidden patterns draws you deeper into the ledger. You are not simply a witness. You are becoming a participant in understanding the invisible forces that shape life and death, obedience and fear. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal the final, darkest nodes of her power. Moments that shook towns, manipulated institutions, and revealed the terrifying mastery of one woman who could bend reality with subtlety alone. By the onset of winter, the true scale of Isabella's influence became impossible to ignore. Reports from towns across Castile had begun to converge in a horrifying pattern, a network of sudden illnesses, mysterious collapses, and deaths among priests that could no longer be explained away. Bishops convened behind locked doors, scribes recorded events in secret, and magistrates debated what could be revealed without shattering the church's image. Fear had become institutionalized, a silent partner in her design, reinforcing her control even as they tried to investigate. Valdez moved cautiously, documenting her path with precision, noting towns, dates, symptoms, and even minor details that others dismissed as trivial. A teaspoon placed too carefully, a plate aligned exactly with the edge of the table, the faint scent of almonds lingering like a ghost. Each observation built a clearer picture, a ledger of influence stretching like roots beneath the surface of society. He realized that Isabella's genius was not simply her knowledge of herbs, it was her ability to manipulate the very structures around her. Institutions, trust, ritual, and obedience had all become instruments of her power. The cover-ups began to cascade. Letters were intercepted BF, or they left diocesan offices. Doctors who noted unusual patterns were reassigned, their warnings buried in files that would never see light. Priests who asked questions were quietly moved to distant parishes. Valdez understood then that the church itself, unknowingly, had become an accomplice to her ledger. The same mechanisms meant to protect the innocent were now shielding a calculated hand of destruction. Meanwhile, Coma townsfolk whispered her name in fear. La Esposa del Veneno. Servants crossed themselves when she entered kitchens, mothers shielded their children at mass. Yet she remained unchallenged, moving like a shadow through daily life, smiling politely, adjusting plates, pouring wine, gestures that seemed harmless, routine, comforting. Each act was deliberate, a lesson in patience, control, and invisibility. And now, as you follow these events, consider yourself a participant in the ledger's rhythm. Notice the patterns, the silences, the timing, the manipulation of perception. You are observing not only history, but a template for unseen influence that still operates today, quietly shaping human behavior and institutional responses. Step closer, because the next section will reveal her most audacious acts, moments that stretched her power to its terrifying limit and demonstrated the depth of the church's silent complicity. As winter deepened, the ledger of Isabella Aranda's influence grew heavier, the pattern clearer, the consequences more terrifying. Entire towns trembled under a shadow that could not be named. Priests fell sick after meals that seemed ordinary, bishops convened in secret, and magistrates struggled to piece together fragments of reports that were systematically erased. Fear had become a silent partner in her method, invisible, unquestioned, and absolute. In Salamanca, she executed one of her most audacious acts. A gathering of prominent priests and visiting dignitaries was planned, a feast designed to celebrate a minor ecclesiastical victory. Isabella moved among the tables with serene composure, adjusting candles, polishing chalices, pouring wine, and placing dishes with impeccable precision. To the untrained eye, she was a model of devotion and grace. To Valdez, observing from the shadows, she was orchestrating a symphony of death with every gesture. The subtle scent of almonds lingered in the air, unnoticed by most, yet it marked the beginning of the end for several prominent clergy. Within hours, priests began collapsing, pale, trembling, clutching their stomachs, some vomiting, others fainting outright. Panic swept the dining hall, yet her calm remained unbroken. No one could comprehend the rhythm of her actions or the depth of her planning. The church's institutions scrambled to contain the chaos. Letters disappeared, inquiries were delayed, and physicians' notes were quietly reclassified or destroyed. The pattern of concealment mirrored the deadly precision of the poison itself. Valdez realized the scale of what he faced. This was no longer a series of isolated events, but a demonstration of total control. Institutions, obedience, and ritual had all been weaponized. Her influence stretched like invisible roots beneath the foundations of every parish she touched, manipulating perception, silencing dissent, and leaving destruction in its wake. She had become both conductor and unseen hand, teaching an invisible lesson in the mastery of patience, observation, and psychological manipulation. And now, as you listen, recognize the same lesson. The ledger is not only historical, it is a template for unseen influence in our world today. Each observation you make, each subtle pattern you notice, draws you deeper into the architecture of control. By writing, by noticing, by following the rhythm, you engage with the ledger itself. The next sections will push you further into this rabbit hole, showing the consequences of such mastery and the terrifying limits of institutional silence. The aftermath of Salamanca's banquet was immediate and unsettling. Townsfolk whispered in hushed tones about a woman whose calm smile concealed lethal intent. Priests who survived spoke in coded language, carefully avoiding mention of her name, aware that even acknowledgement could draw her attention. Meanwhile, the church worked frantically behind closed doors, trying to conceal what had happened without revealing the horrifying pattern. Letters were intercepted, reports reclassified, and physicians reassigned. The ledger of influence had expanded beyond a single town. It now spanned regions, its invisible lines connecting towns and individuals who had no idea they were part of the same deadly design. Valdez observed the chaos with growing dread. He documented the timeline, the symptoms, and the subtle signs of manipulation, the deliberate placement of utensils, the precise pouring of wine, the faint almond scent that lingered in the air. Every detail pointed to a methodical mind at work, someone who had anticipated each response, each attempt at scrutiny, and each institutional blind spot. She had mastered the art of operating in plain sight, ensuring that fear, obedience, and routine all worked in her favor. As word of multiple deaths spread, fear became a tangible presence in every town she visited. Families clutched children tightly during Mass, shopkeepers whispered warnings under their breath, and priests hesitated before meals. But her calm, serene demeanor remained unchanged. She had turned invisibility into power. No one dared confront her, yet everyone recognized the danger she represented. Every act, every gesture reinforced the lesson that influence could operate silently, invisibly, yet with devastating effect. And now, listening closely, you are beginning to see what Valdez documented so meticulously. The ledger is not simply a record of deaths. It is a stew, in control, perception, and manipulation. You are tracing the same patterns he saw: the timing, the rhythm, the exploitation of trust, and the invisibility of mastery. This is the moment to understand that influence, once unnoticed, can shape lives, bend institutions, and remain undetected until it is far too late. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal how her power reached its peak, exposing the terrifying extent of her control and the depth of the church's complicity. By early winter, the shadow of Isabella's influence had grown so dense that even towns untouched directly by her presence felt the ripple of fear. Rumors traveled faster than carriages, whispered in marketplaces, over hearths, and along cobblestone streets. People began to notice patterns: the sudden collapse of a priest after a carefully prepared meal, the faint smell of almonds in kitchens, the meticulous arrangement of utensils, candles, and plates. To the untrained eye, these were coincidences. To Valdez, they were the heartbeat of a deadly rhythm, the signature of a mind that understood control as absolute. The church, now aware that the pattern could no longer be ignored, scrambled to contain the crisis. Bishops and magistrates convened in secret, attempting to trace her movements, hoping to identify weak points in her carefully crafted itinerary. Yet every effort was delayed, diverted, or intercepted. Physicians' reports disappeared, letters were quietly confiscated, and warnings sent too late. Isabella had anticipated these institutional responses, folding them seamlessly into her design. Her mastery lay not only in poisoning the body, but in manipulating perception, silencing curiosity, and weaponizing trust. In Valladolid, another banquet unfolded. This time Valdez observed from a distance, heart pounding as he noted every gesture. She poured wine with the precision of a clockmaker, adjusted candles as if composing a symphony, and placed dishes with calculated care. One by one, priests began to falter. Pale faces, trembling hands, shallow breaths. The hall became a theater of silent horror, the invisible ledger unfolding in real time. Panic erupted quietly. No one could confront her, and the church's intervention was slow, clumsy, and ultimately ineffective. Meanwhile, calmer townsfolk whispered her name with fear. La Esposa del Veneno. Mothers shielded children, servants crossed themselves, and priests approached meals with caution bordering on superstition. Isabella moved through all of it undisturbed, her serene composure a testament to her mastery. She was no longer merely a woman. She had become a force, a demonstration of how invisible control, patience, and anticipation could bend reality and manipulate institutions. And now, listening, you trace the same architecture. Observe the rhythm, the subtle manipulations, the exploitation of trust. You are following the ledger alongside Valdez, noticing the same patterns that others ignore, recognizing the flow of influence and control. Step carefully, because the next sections will show how her final acts escalated, how panic became public, and how the ledger's reach threatened the very structures meant to contain it. By the end of winter, fear had begun to bleed into the streets. Towns that had not directly encountered Isabella felt her presence through rumor, through the sudden death of a neighboring priest, through the subtle patterns that people could not name but instinctively feared. The church's leadership, once confident in its authority, now trembled behind closed doors. Bishops whispered, magistrates fretted, and Valdez alone was tracing the invisible hand with clarity, his ledger of influence expanding with each passing day. In Burgos, the tension reached a new height. Isabella was invited to a grand gathering of priests, a routine banquet that would have gone unnoticed under normal circumstances. But this was no ordinary evening, and Valdez had positioned himself to observe discreetly, noting every gesture, the precise pouring of wine, the careful alignment of plates, the subtle crushing of herbs. Each movement was a note in a deadly symphony. Within hours, priests began to falter, their bodies betraying the unseen manipulation that was unfolding before the eyes of those who refused to acknowledge it. Panic rose quietly, contained only by fear of scandal and obedience to ritual. The church scrambled. Letters were intercepted, reports suppressed, and physicians reassigned. Every attempt at intervention was anticipated, neutralized, folded seamlessly into the rhythm of her method. Valdez realized that the ledger was not merely a record of deaths, but a map of control. Every death, every delay, every silenced voice was another line in her architecture of influence. She had weaponized not just poison, but perception, trust, and institutional inertia. Townsfolk whispered her name, La Esposa del Veneno, in fear, crossing themselves when she entered kitchens, shielding children, and murmuring prayers under their breath. And yet, she moved as always, serene, composed, untouchable. Her mastery lay in invisibility, in the ability to operate in plain sight, while shaping events with precision. Even the institutions meant to prevent her actions became unwitting accomplices, their delays and omissions woven into the ledger of her control. And now listening, you are tracing the same invisible patterns. The rhythm of manipulation, the subtle orchestration of fear, the exploitation of trust. You see it unfolding not only in history, but in perception itself. Each detail you notice, each connection you make, pulls you deeper into the architecture of secrecy. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal the climax of her influence, the point at which the church itself was forced to confront the terrifying depth of her mastery. By spring, the first waves of public panic had begun to surface. Rumors of priests falling ill in sudden, inexplicable ways were no longer confined to whispered warnings in private parlors. They spread through marketplaces, taverns, and even church pews. Villagers began to recognize a pattern, though they could not articulate its precision. Fear became tangible, a living presence that followed every step of daily life. Mothers clutched their children tighter, servants crossed themselves at the sight of a familiar smile, and priests approached their duties with a hesitant caution previously unknown. Isabella, however, continued her work with serene composure. Every gesture was deliberate, from the alignment of utensils to the pouring of wine, from the selection of herbs to the placement of candles. She moved like a shadow that was both everywhere and nowhere, invisible yet omnipresent. Her mastery lay not only in poison, but in perception itself. She knew how to manipulate trust, exploit routine, and anticipate institutional responses. Every attempt at control by authorities became another layer woven seamlessly into her ledger of influence. Valdez observed her closely, documenting every detail. He noted the subtle patterns, the timing of deaths, the geographical spread, the silence of institutions, the obedience that masked complicity. The ledger had become more than a record of mortality. It was a map of control. Through her actions, Isabella had demonstrated the absolute potential of invisible influence. How one individual, operating with precision, patience, and understanding of human psychology, could manipulate entire systems without detection. The church, now aware that the whispers could no longer be contained, scrambled to intervene. Meetings in hidden chambers grew frantic. Letters were sent, reports were intercepted, and physicians' warnings were ignored or delayed. Each of these actions, intended to preserve order, played perfectly into her hands. She had weaponized not only chemical knowledge but also human obedience, institutional delay, and fear itself. And now as you listen, you are stepping into the rhythm of the ledger. You are tracing the invisible lines of influence, the manipulation of perception, the orchestration of events that remain unseen by ordinary eyes. Every observation you make strengthens your understanding of hidden control. The next sections will reveal the crescendo of her power, the point at which the panic became undeniable, and the church faced a reality that could no longer be hidden. By mid-spring, the first cracks of widespread panic were visible. Entire towns whispered her name in fear, La Esposa del Veneno. Parents hurried their children home from church, shopkeepers glanced nervously at visitors, and even the most devout priests approached meals with hesitation bordering on superstition. The deaths were no longer rumors. They were undeniable, sudden, and inexplicable to anyone unwilling to see the pattern. And yet, Isabella moved among them, serene and composed, her gestures precise, her presence both comforting and deadly. Valdez, now fully obsessed, traced the ledger across the map of Castile. He documented the rhythm of her influence, how one town's tragedy echoed into the next, how reports of illness coincided with her visits, how subtle signals, a faint scent of almonds, the careful arrangement of dishes, marked the invisible hand at work. He understood the terrifying truth. She had weaponized perception, trust, and obedience itself. The church's own inertia, its delays and silences, had become her shield. Institutions meant to protect lives were now instruments in her design. The panic reached its apex in Toledo. A gathering of priests, including visiting dignitaries, fell ill in rapid succession. Within hours, those present realized the impossibility of the events unfolding before them. Servants whispered warnings, mothers prayed fervently, and magistrates scrambled to send for physicians. Yet her calm remained unshaken, her smile untouched, her movements deliberate. Esau, he was the embodiment of invisible control, teaching, without words, the lesson that mastery of perception could outweigh brute force. Even the church could no longer ignore what was happening. Bishops held urgent meetings behind locked doors, trying to reconstruct events from fragmented reports. They debated the morality of silence versus revelation, the need to preserve authority versus the demand for truth. And in every discussion, in every delayed letter and censored report, Isabella's influence remained evident. She had created a network of unseen control, turning fear, obedience, and ritual into tools of manipulation. And now, listening carefully, you are tracing the same invisible patterns. The rhythm of influence, the orchestration of perception, the subtle manipulations of trust. You are following the ledger alongside Valdez, noticing details others dismiss. Step closer, because the next sections will reveal her final acts of audacious control, the full magnitude of her mastery, and how the institutions meant to stop her were instead silently complicit in her deadly design. As spring deepened, Isabella's mastery reached its terrifying climax. She no longer needed to move from town to town unnoticed. Her reputation had become a tool in itself. Fear, like a living entity, preceded her. Priests hesitated before every meal. Servants crossed themselves in anticipation, and townsfolk whispered warnings that barely contained their terror. And yet she moved through it all with unbroken composure, as if orchestrating a symphony that only she could hear. Valdez, obsessed and meticulous, traced her path with the precision of a cartographer mapping an invisible empire. He recorded each death, each faint scent of almonds, each ritual that masked her intent. He realized that her genius was not simply in poison, but in the psychological architecture she had built. Invisible, pervasive, and precise. She had weaponized trust, routine, and institutional inertia. Every cover-up, every delay, every moment of obedience was folded into her design, reinforcing the ledger of influence that had already spanned an entire region. In Burgos, a banquet intended to celebrate the arrival of a visiting bishop became another demonstration of her absolute control. Wine was poured, candles adjusted, plates aligned. Every gesture a calculated note in her lethal symphony. Priests began collapsing, one after another, pale and trembling, while the servants and other attendees struggled to comprehend what was happening. Panic rippled silently through the hall, contained only by fear of scandal and respect for ritual. Yet Isabella's calm never faltered. She moved with serene precision, the architect of chaos hidden in plain sight. The church, finally realizing the scale of her actions, scrambled in desperation. Letters were dispatched, physicians summoned, magistrates pressed to investigate. But each intervention, each delayed or suppressed report was anticipated. Her mastery of human perception and institutional delay ensured that even these efforts played into her hands. Fear, obedience, and trust had become instruments of her control, and she wielded them as effectively as any poison. And now, listening closely, you are witnessing the apex of her influence. Every gesture, every subtle pattern, every manipulation of trust is part of a ledger you are tracing with your own awareness. The architecture of control is visible to those who know how to see. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal the consequences of this mastery, the final unraveling of her network, and the haunting truths that continue to linger in the shadows of history. By late spring, the pressure on the church and local authorities had become unbearable. Townsfolk no longer whispered quietly. Fear had erupted into anxious glances, frantic prayers, and hushed warnings in marketplaces. Priests fell ill with terrifying regularity, and Valdez's ledger of influence had grown into a sprawling map, charting not just deaths, but the subtle manipulation of perception, obedience, and institutional inertia. Each entry in the ledger was a testament to her mastery, invisible, methodical, and absolute. The church finally attempted a coordinated intervention. Bishops and magistrates devised a plan to monitor her movements, to scrutinize meals and gatherings, to observe her closely and catch her in the act. Physicians were assigned to attend banquets, letters were sent ahead warning of her presence, and the hierarchy of parishes began to cooperate. But she had anticipated these measures. Each response, each effort at control, became another instrument in her design. Her mastery of human perception allowed her to operate undetected, even under scrutiny. The very institutions designed to restrain her were bending to her rhythm. Valdez followed her as carefully as ever, documenting every gesture, every arrangement of plates and chalices, every faint almond scent that betrayed her hand. He realized the ledger was more than a record of deaths. It was a blueprint for invisible control. Each act of obedience by others, each delayed report, each misinterpretation of events strengthened her power, reinforcing the rhythm of her invisible influence. Even now, centuries later, the pattern could be traced in the careful alignment of actions and reactions, a map of how subtle mastery could bend perception without leaving evidence. And yet cracks were beginning to appear. In Valladolid, a servant noticed an unusual pattern in the timing of illnesses and discreetly reported it to Valdez. In Burgos, a physician began recording detailed observations that survived censorship. Small, seemingly insignificant acts of awareness began to unravel parts of the ledger, revealing glimpses of her method to those willing to see. And now, as you listen, understand this. The ledger is not merely history. Every subtle gesture, every manipulation of perception, every silent act of control is a lesson in mastery. You are tracing these patterns alongside Valdez, noticing what others ignore. Write in the comments twice a symbolic phrase of recognition, to mark your awareness, to lock your identity into the rhythm of observation, and to engage with the ledger itself. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal the unraveling of her network and the terrifying truths that emerge when mastery is challenged. By early summer, the first successful interruptions to Isabella's rhythm began to surface, though only in fragments. A few perceptive priests, physicians, and servants started noticing patterns others ignored. They recorded subtle details, the faint bitterness of almonds in wine, the exact sequence of dishes served, the timing of illnesses that followed her presence. These observations, small and tentative, threatened to pierce the veil of her invisible control. Yet each revelation came at a cost: fear, isolation, and the constant awareness that discovery could provoke retaliation from both her and the complicit institutions. Valdez, now fully immersed in the ledger, began connecting these fragments like a detective piecing together a vast invisible map. He realized that while her mastery was absolute, it was not infallible. Her influence depended on invisibility, obedience, and routine. When these variables were disrupted even slightly, her control faltered. He documented each anomaly meticulously, noting how isolated acts of awareness could ripple through her network, weakening the architecture she had so carefully constructed. In Toledo, for example, a visiting physician refused to taste the wine and observed the preparation of the meal with a critical eye. He noted every movement, every herb, every minor deviation from routine. When the priests were served, several remained unharmed. Panic erupted. No, not among the victims, but among the observers. They glimpsed the ledger's pattern and the invisible hand behind it. Fear now included a new element, the possibility that her method could be challenged, even if only partially. Meanwhile, townsfolk began to sense cracks in the aura of invincibility she had cultivated. Rumors shifted from mere fear to suspicion, and small acts of caution started to spread. Mothers watched more closely, servants questioned instructions, and priests became wary of the routine they had once accepted blindly. Her shadow remained, but it no longer extended unquestioned. And now, as you follow this story, recognize the same lesson in perception and influence. Every detail matters. Every observation, every act of awareness is a crack in the ledger of control. You are tracing patterns, noticing subtleties, and learning the rhythm of invisible mastery. Step carefully, because the next sections will reveal the confrontation, the unraveling of her network, and the horrifying truths uncovered when mastery is finally challenged.